Well, obviously, we got some problems with that story there. We'll try to get back for you in just a few minutes as we look at the motorcade making its way to Ellington Field this morning.
Members of the Bush family in that large bus there, they all met at the Lewis and Sons funeral home, oh gosh, about 20 minutes ago or so, to move his body into into the hearse and then get on the road heading to Ellington Air Force Base. We were listening to the number of family members who were on board. We even saw Sully.
Yes,
the service dog.
This presidential service dog who will now be servicing some other veterans' family in the future.
Yes, heading back to Walter Reed. But yes, you're looking live at the motorcade. Doug Deloney, how much longer is this procession going to last, do you estimate?
They're probably going to have another 25 minutes ahead of them. And now look at the number of people who've gotten even greater heads up to take a look as well. So again, eastbound on the 610 South Loop, passing by the NRG Stadium area. And I would expect at this point they're probably going to take the Gulf Freeway heading southbound, and then they'll take Beltway 8 heading eastbound and use that to exit into Ellington Airport. So they probably have another 20-25 minutes at this pace. They're not going the full speed they normally could. When we've seen motorcades in the past, when presidents have come to town and they have similar motorcades, you know, President Trump was here recently, just a few weeks ago, they still would leave one side of the freeway open, but the motorcade would travel much faster than this. But obviously this is a much different scenario, it being a funeral motorcade, a procession, so people paying their respects, pulling over to stop, and they are taking their time with it. They're going at an easy pace, and it's nice to see some people paying their respects, but as you said, Ron, I hope that everything comes out safely from it, with people stopping randomly on the freeway. And some people look like they're just stopping out of respects, because that's what you would do when a funeral motorcade or a procession would pass you by, especially if you were out in the country. Yes. Everyone stops in both directions.
Do the sign of the cross or whatever you feel is appropriate. And it's actually, this is a beautiful sight. It can be a bit dangerous, but it is beautiful to see. And even though we're talking about President Bush in celebratory terms and a celebration of his life, this is touching, and it's sad too to see someone who's been such a big part of our lives,
exactly,
leading us.
Yeah, it's going to be definitely a missing piece of the country, but Houston especially, to have both him and Barbara pass in the same year. It's really something else. And we know there's other Bush family members that still live here. They're so actively involved with different organizations, and it's so great when we see their son and their grandson show up at different events. George W. Bush obviously lives in Dallas. So Bush family, their legacy is still very much alive and well in Houston and in Texas.
Yes,
but this is a big piece of Houston that will be missing for us. They just passed over Fannin, by the way. So they're still on the 610 South Loop, passing over Fannin. They're about to come across 288. I don't think they'll take 288. I think they're going to stay on the 610 South Loop all the way to the Gulf Freeway and then use that to connect to the Beltway.
As you said, the Bush family entrenched in Houston, part of the fabric of Houston, part of the fabric of Texas, and indeed part of the fabric of America.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Our Sherman Chow is live at the Bush Presidential Library at Texas A&M in College Station. Let's check in with Sherman. Good morning, Sherman.
Hey, good morning to you all. Yeah, we are actually inside that presidential library where they have graciously allowed us to broadcast to you this morning. There has been, as you can imagine, a steady stream of visitors coming in, a lot of attention and thought about the former president, number 41, at his passing. And we are now in the rotunda. If you walk into the library, you will see these huge banners that circle the alcove here, and they mark key moments in his life. The first one here, of course, is young George Bush, the naval aviator who enlisted in the military on his 18th birthday. He was, of course, shot down during the Second World War, where he served. He returned home to go to Yale University, where he graduated from. He was captain of the baseball team there. And while he attended Yale, Texas A&M, of course, houses the Presidential Library and Museum. Next banner up over here is the first family in front of Congress, where he was a two-term congressman from Texas. And again, to the right, you can see him there also serving in Congress. Up here to the center, the George Bush Library, and you can see below, folks are signing these condolence books. They have left little mementos and notes, some of whom will recall something personal that they had had perhaps a chance meeting with him. One young man saying he recalled when they went ahead and the first couple came and read to the library. Let's take a peek over the shoulder here if we can, and if you want to take a look, we can see some of the things that are being signed. I'll read one or two of them to you. It says, "You were a great leader, inspired so many people, and will be remembered in our heart." Thank you. Thank you for your service. Others saying thank you for your dedication to this country. You've inspired all future generations. It's really been quite a few of these little remembrances, mementos, as people sign their names and their thoughts and their good wishes for the First Family. Mr. Bush, of course, will be returning here to Texas A&M on Thursday, where he will be buried. There's a family plot in a little wooded grove right behind the library. It's actually closed right now, presumably for the groundskeepers and other folks to prepare for that burial, which will be on Thursday afternoon. It'll be a private ceremony, but folks getting everything ready. This library will be closed tomorrow and the next day in advance of the service on Thursday, and then it'll be reopened on Friday and Saturday. On Friday and Saturday as well. It'll be free admission because they certainly want organizers, administrators here want people to learn about the first couple. And one of the things they want to stress to people is that this library, this museum is not just about President Bush, but it is also about the First Lady, about Barbara Bush and her life of service. So before we leave you, I'm going to show you the rest of the banners up here. You can see President Bush in his office, and then to the right, he was ambassador to China. There he is with Barbara, Chairman Mao in the background there. Then to the right again, he was director of the CIA, and then the final banner here of him at the White House, of course, where he served as vice president to Ronald Reagan, and then, of course, himself a president. So this is just the foyer. A lot more to go inside, and if we get a chance, maybe we'll show you some more of that. But, yep, you can see more folks coming on in, and a lot of people wanting to learn more about President and Mrs. Bush and their long life of public service. Guys?
All right, thank you so much, Sharon Min, as we take another live look from Air 11.
Well, successful businessman, a lawmaker, a diplomat, a cabinet member, second in command, ultimately as leader of the free world, Bush 41 would quickly witness world events that would only add to a life of remarkable experience.
More on that now from Mia Gradney.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
George Bush spent most of his adult life preparing for this moment, and by many accounts during his presidency, he would face some of the most difficult decisions of any president in a generation.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
He'd been the understudy for 8 years, and decades before, a bit player on the world stage, who watched others take the spotlight and make the important decisions.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, as the nation's 41st president, it was his turn, his moment, his time to write the chapters of American history. It took him all of 17 days to get started.
I call on the Congress to join me in a determined effort to resolve this threat to the American financial system.
George Bush started his presidential tenure with a financial crisis. The savings and loan industry was collapsing. Big financial institutions, S&Ls, had ventured into risky investments.
But I think we all agree.
The president would propose a bailout. He reached a compromise with Congress that cost taxpayers more than $100 billion. Ultimately, the bailout would only add to a difficult financial environment the president confronted during his presidency, and it was just February. In fact, for most of his presidency, the challenges seemed to erupt like a West Texas gusher, and by June, domestic policy would take a back seat to his first international crisis. The tanks were rolling in China. The People's Liberation Army was in no mood for liberty, and the Chinese government was determined to suppress a growing pro-democracy movement that had set up camp in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. By June 5th, he had condemned the action and announced sanctions against the Chinese. It would be the first of many foreign policy decisions that would require the president's full attention. In November, all eyes had shifted to the Berlin Wall. The wall was a symbolic anchor for communism and was sinking fast. And it would give George Bush one of his defining moments.
Clearly, this is a long way from the harsh days of the harshest Iron Curtain days.
By December, George Bush was sitting down with Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, negotiating nuclear disarmament and proclaiming the end of the Cold War. It was a watershed moment for the Bush presidency. He would finally step out of Ronald Reagan's shadow. 3 weeks later, Bush was back in the spotlight. A few days before Christmas, the president ordered U.S. forces into Panama. Operation Just Cause was a go.
No president takes such action lightly.
The troops were after Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega. His forces were accused of killing an unarmed American serviceman, wounding another, arresting and brutally beating a third. The fighting lasted 4 days. 23 U.S. fighters were killed. Noriega would be captured, indicted in the U.S., and convicted of drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. 1990 may have been the president's best domestic policy year, but he would later admit it would also be the beginning of the end of his presidency.
The Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no, and they'll push, and I'll say no, and they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips, no new taxes.
Remember that? 18 months into his term, George Bush was saying, read my press release. There will be new taxes. The president said he was forced to renege on his pledge, saying it was the only way to solve the ballooning deficit problem.
And it is very important for the country.
He made that decision at his own political peril.
In the early morning hours of August 2nd, Iraqi armed forces, without provocation or warning, invaded a peaceful Kuwait. Iraq, having committed brutal naked aggression, ought to get out.
And that would set the stage for America's first major military encounter since Vietnam. And then 1991 came in with a bang. If the end of the Cold War helped define George Bush's legacy, January 17, 1991 would solidify it. At that moment, he really was the leader of the free world, successfully organized, leading a coalition of 25 countries in Operation Desert Storm. The liberation of Kuwait began with a massive American-led air attack on Iraq. It didn't take American warplanes long to pound Saddam's Republican Guard into submission. Within a few weeks, ground troops were sprinting through the Iraqi desert. A little more than a month after it started, the president called off the offensive.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated.
These were the best of times for George Bush. His approval rating was at an all-time high, reaching a stratospheric 89% in the days after the invasion, the highest of any president up to that point in time. The sweet taste of victory would turn sour in the summer of '91, the faltering U.S. economy and other divisive domestic issues. Consensus would be hard to come by, which was clearly evident by October, when the president got another chance to leave his mark on the Supreme Court.
Provide all of the available protection.
Clarence Thomas was the president's nominee to replace Justice Thurgood Marshall. The confirmation hearing turned into a steamy soap opera.
To help you, God.
I do. And Americans were exposed to allegations of sexual harassment and pornographic videos.
Listen to a testimony. No, I didn't. I've heard enough lies.
It was embarrassing and combative.
This is high-tech lynching.
But ultimately, Thomas was narrowly confirmed by the Senate.
Move soon, though.
In many ways, the political environment was much like the food at a presidential dinner in Tokyo. Hard to stomach.
The president has a case of gastroenteritis, commonly known as intestinal flu.
It was January of 1992. The president got sick and threw up on the Japanese prime minister. And for that, George Bush received more animosity than empathy, another indication of how the environment had turned viral. But George Bush would rise above the political poison. George Bush and new Russian President Boris Yeltsin announced an agreement that would dramatically reduce nuclear warheads. It would be a moment to savor for any president. But at the time, George Bush never realized this event on June 16th would be his last major foreign policy act as president. Shortly thereafter, it would be time for the nation's 41st president to exit stage left.
That was our Mia Gradney reporting.
Yes, and we give you two shots now, one from the ground and one from Air 11 of I-45 and the beginning of that motorcade making its way through I-45.
Doug, where exactly are they at this point?
That's right. They just came off of the 610 South Loop connecting to the Gulf Freeway, heading southbound, of course. And you can see on the left-hand side, the screen you're seeing on the left-hand side of your television right now, that is the main portion of the motorcade just connecting to I-45. This is the University of Houston area right by our studios right now. And that bus you see in the background, of course, you can see the hearse in the foreground, and then the two buses in the background carrying different members of the Bush family. We believe the Secret Service possibly on there that served in part of his detail that helped put the casket inside that motorcade. And here comes the hearse right by our camera right now.
And they are heading, of course, to Ellington, where there will be a departure ceremony. We do want to check in with our Josh Marshall, who's live at Ellington Air Force Base. What's going on right now, Josh?
Well, right now we're watching the final preparations for Houston's president to arrive at Ellington Airfield for what will be about a 30 to 35 minute ceremony here. The plane and the final preparations have been made just outside on the tarmac. The band is just outside of sight, but we're told this will be about a 35-minute ceremony with full military honors, including a 21-gun salute from cannons that are set up on the far side of the tarmac. What will happen is the motorcade will arrive. The friends and family who are here, about 100 to 150 of them standing next to the media, will then go out. They'll pull the casket out. They'll be able to have a ceremony. They will have a band here, as well as a chorus who will sit and sing a hymn. Once they do start singing, that's when the truck that you see parked right in front of Special Air Mission 41, that's actually for the casket. They'll load the casket into the truck and lift it into what is otherwise known as Air Force One. But when the motorcade does arrive, we will have the live picture up, but there will be no commentary from the press while that happens. For now, we're just standing and waiting. No other new information happening out here. Just heard that the motorcade is making its way past the University of Houston, so we'll be standing by for when it arrives. Guys, back to you.
Okay, so Josh, once again, you've got the military honor guard that's just arrived. What else is going to be happening there ceremonially before President Bush leaves Houston?
Well, what I'm told is they're going to be having their friends and family once the motorcade pulls up, and they'll all have time to talk amongst themselves, but they'll be doing their own ceremony here, so you will have a little bit of scripture read as well as singing happening. They said it'd take about 30 to 35 minutes, like I said, and then there'll be the 21-gun salute on the other side of the tarmac before the 41st president is then loaded into what's being called Special Air Mission 41.
Josh Marshall, thank you for the latest. We'll check back in with you. Politics, of course, such a big part of the Bush family. Mr. Bush answered the call to serve his country from an early age.
Over the years, history unfolded, and he was right in the middle of it all. Russ Lewis has more on that.
It was in Houston in 1992 that George Bush accepted the nomination for a second term as president.
For a fellow Texan and my friend, George Bush.
Earlier in the week, the Texas vote gave him the delegates he needed. Texans always claimed him as a favorite son, even though he was not born one. He was actually born in Massachusetts to a privileged family. His father, Prescott, was a senator from Connecticut. He went to Yale, where his son and future President George W. would also attend. But Bush's supporters in Texas took to him. He had, after all, come to this state as a young oil man to make his fortune. It seemed he followed that old Texas saying that he wasn't born in this state, but he got here as quickly as he could. In the 60s, Texans sent him to Congress.
I hope to have support from all segments of society, and I'm sure.
By 1970, he was ready to follow his father to the Senate and took on another ambitious young Texas politician named Lloyd Bentsen, and Bentsen beat him.
I wish him the best.
Bush became ambassador to the UN, an envoy to China, and then director of the CIA. In 1980, he ran for president and accused Ronald Reagan of advocating voodoo economics, only to be trounced in the primary. He ended up Reagan's running mate.
I want a kinder and gentler nation.
8 years later, Bush sought the job for himself in a contest that pitted him against Michael Dukakis and Bush's old Texas adversary, Lloyd Bentsen. And this time, it was Bush's team that won in a landslide. But during that campaign, he made a promise that would come back to haunt him.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
The thing that people liked about George H.W. Bush was that, in many ways, for all the wealth, privilege, and power, he seemed like a down-to-earth guy. On a flight into Houston on the eve of the '92 election, he took time to give a Houston reporter a personal tour of Air Force One. He could laugh when a comic called him a mix of Mr. Rogers and John Wayne.
Over the ridge, you put them together, you got George Herbert Walker Bush. That's the thing.
And when he wanted to go skydiving, he did it. The first time to relive his World War II survival in the Pacific. The second time for his 80th birthday, just because he wanted to do it.
You know, because you're 80 years old, that doesn't mean you're out of it, out of the game.
He proved that again by jumping out of an airplane when he turned 85, and once again on his 90th birthday. In fact, he never really wanted to be out of the game. When Bush 43 asked his father to team up with former President Clinton for tsunami relief, he took the job, and they became what Barbara Bush called America's favorite couple, touring devastated places and raising millions to help victims get back on their feet. As for his own life, George Herbert Walker Bush was a man who believed in living it.
He most certainly did. Thank you, Russ Lewis, for that as we continue to have an aerial look of the motorcade making its way to Ellington Air Base today.
Let's check in with Doug Deloney right now for the latest on the traffic situation. Doug, good morning.
Yeah, this is the Gulf Freeway, I-45 heading southbound. All lanes are shut down right now as this motorcade passes through. You can see on the northbound side, which is on the left side of that view from Air 11, some people are stopping as they realize this is a funeral procession passing by, but then they take a closer look probably and realize that hearse has the presidential seal on the side. It's got the 2 American flags, and it certainly has a much bigger motorcade than your typical funeral procession, of course, this being for President Bush. So right now, they're heading southbound on the Gulf Freeway, heading through the Edgebrook area. If they follow the route that they've previously followed for various presidential motorcades, they're probably going to take the Beltway heading eastbound, and then they'll take that first exit to connect to the Ellington Air Force Base area. They could also access it from the Gulf Freeway, but certainly there will be delays in this area, and rightfully so, as people stop to pay their respects. Of course, it's always a little bit of a dangerous situation, especially on that side of the freeway that's still open heading northbound or heading into Houston. It's still technically open, but as we've seen as this motorcade passes by, and now we're looking live from Houston TransStar, a freeway camera closer to the ground as the motorcade approaches on the left-hand side there. But as we've seen people get a vantage point of what's happening, they're stopping, they're pulling over, and they're getting ready for it to pass by because they kind of anticipated it. The more time they've had to prepare and realize that it was coming, they've pulled over and stopped, and you can see people getting out. Just having a moment of silence as the motorcade passes by, I'm sure. And there are the 2 buses, by the way, that a lot of the Bush family members are riding in. President Bush's service dog is also apparently riding in one of those buses as well, along with the president's Secret Service detail that has served him so loyally for many years here in Houston as they went about their lives after the White House. And certainly as people stop and they take those photos, they're paying their respects, and then the freeways kind of reopen and they move on. But another look, Houston TransStar, this is at Alameda Genoa. Again, the first portion of that motorcade comes through, several police officers on motorcycles closing down those on-ramps, making sure the roadway is clear, and then you have this kind of long dramatic pause of just concrete and waiting. And if you're in the area and you don't know what's coming, it's certainly, I mean, it's a somber treat, but it's certainly a treat, for, especially for people who have met the president or seen him and Barbara at events throughout the years. Sporting events, if you've lived for any given amount of time in the Houston area, you've probably seen them at some point, and certainly it's a real treat to have this moment, especially if you were not expecting it. And so now, as you can see, the first part of the motorcade approaching on the left-hand side. And again, on the left-hand side of this television screen, I have a map pulled up of where the Air Force Base is, of course, or Ellington Airport, as many people call it now, right there at the Gulf Freeway and Beltway 8.
All right, thank you so much, Doug Deloney, as the stillness of the freeway there.
Let's check in right now with our Janelle Fort live at Ellington. Janelle, some activity from your vantage point there.
Hey guys, yeah, as Doug just said, the motorcade should be arriving here any minute now. If you're looking out, you can see Color Guard is set up, as well as that band getting ready for this ceremony to start right at 10:30 here. Throughout the morning, we've been telling you kind of how this ceremony is going to go. That motorcade will come on here onto the tarmac, stop in front of the family. They'll take that casket out. The family will get to pay their last respects here, and then the band will start playing, and they'll begin that ceremony. As we said, throughout the morning, it's been pretty busy here, only set to get even more busy as this ceremony begins, as I said, just in a couple of minutes here. They'll hop on the plane. Air Force One, for the sake of this special journey, is being called Special Air Mission 41. The president will hop on board with his close family, as well as his service pup Sully, as they head to the Capitol for this ceremony. And we're gonna have to send it back to you guys because we can't be live. The ceremony is just starting right now.
So much, Janelle Fort. Of course, we will continue our coverage. I believe CBS News will be continuing our coverage in just a few seconds. So keep it right here as we continue to watch the ceremony at Ellington Air Base today. The motorcade should be arriving probably within the next 5 or 10 minutes, I believe.
We're turning now to CBS coverage of this special event.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm John Dickerson with Nora O'Donnell in Washington. Former President George Herbert Walker Bush's casket will soon depart for his final trip to Washington. We're waiting for the motorcade carrying Mr. Bush and members of his family to arrive at Ellington Field Joint Reserve Base in southeast Houston in just a few minutes.
There will be a short service there before the president and his family depart. One of the planes that normally serves as Air Force One will carry the former president to Joint Base Andrews, which is just outside Washington, D.C. We saw the Bush family. They gathered, it was about an hour ago, at a Houston funeral home to escort the 41st president to the airfield. Chip Reed is there at Ellington Field. Chip, good morning.
Well, good morning, Nora. You can see behind me the honor guard is ready for this ceremony to begin. You can also see what we all know as Air Force One, but it's only technically Air Force One when the current president is aboard. That is the same plane that just brought President Trump back from the G20 conference in Argentina. He authorized it to turn around and head here for this very special mission, which is being called Special Air Mission 41 in honor of the 41st president. At this ceremony, which will happen in just a moment, there will be a military honor guard that will very carefully and, of course, with military precision, move the casket from the hearse in the motorcade onto the plane. There will also be a 21-gun salute. President George W. Bush will be here on the tarmac with former First Lady Laura Bush, also several other members of the President Bush's family, and, of course, Sully, the dog that brought tears to so many people's eyes. It has been President Bush's service dog ever since his wife Barbara passed away earlier this year, and we all saw that photograph of Sully lying vigil in front of the president's flag-draped casket yesterday Really an amazing sight. And Sully will join the Bush family for the flight back to Washington, D.C. to Joint Base Andrews, where a motorcade will then take him to the U.S. Capitol, where he will lie in state until Wednesday, when there will then be a memorial service at the National Cathedral. And on Wednesday evening, he will then fly back here to Houston, where there will be a funeral service, and then a train will take him from Houston to College Station to Texas A&M University and the President George H.W. Bush Presidential Library, where there will be a private burial service on Thursday. Nora?
All right, Chip Reed there at Ellington Field, and you can see hundreds of local officials and friends and family have gathered there for a send-off to the 41st President of the United States. We're told they're elected officials from the city, county commissioner, also people from the Points of Light Foundation. The Second Baptist Church there as well, many of the staff there, just people who wanted to be there and say goodbye. The Military Honor Guard there as well, members from every service. President Bush, of course, served in the Navy during World War II, and that's why we say this is the last president of the greatest generation. I noted that the U.S. Navy tweeted when the president passed, "Fair winds and following seas, sir, we have the watch," which was beautifully said. And see, it's a windy day there at the airfield. He will be met there by his son, President George W. Bush, and Laura Bush, who will also greet the other members of the family. This ceremony, everything from what you see right there at Ellington Field to what we will see in Washington when he lies in state, to what's at the National Cathedral, to his burial, all being organized by Major General Michael Howard. He is actually the commanding general of the Joint Force headquarters in the National Capital Region. And he said that this whole ceremony that we're going to watch is the culmination of years of planning and rehearsal to ensure the support the military renders President Bush is, in his words, nothing less than a first-class tribute. And so we get to watch this historic goodbye over the next couple of days. And in some ways, as someone said to me, this is not just saying goodbye to a man, but in many ways an ideal that he represented, John.
Well, we don't, you know, we know what the inaugurations look like. We know what State of the Unions. We know what in politics, these moments are like. This is a fresh, and yet in a sense, it's also re-upping basic American values that he stood for. Service, duty, honor, and that is not just wrapped up in a presidency. We know about the family, the way George Herbert Walker Bush was raised and the way he raised his children, that those are wrapped into the family themselves. And so this is a national story, but it's also a personal family story that contains all of the things that are being celebrated and honored by those honor-guarded attention and by the flags waving.
So I'll just jump in on the conversation here. It's a moment of institutional appreciation as well, the presidency itself, and, as was mentioned a bit earlier, there are times in American history when we look back on a presidency differently than we did when the presidency ended. George Bush's presidency ended with a spectacular defeat in 1992. He'd won 426 electoral votes in '88. He won 168 just 4 years later. A complete elevator shaft.
In a three-way race against Bill Clinton and Ross Perot.
Bill Clinton and Ross Perot. But his political future looked so much brighter mid-term of that first term of his presidency. What he ended up with seemed almost inconceivable. And for that reason, we've looked back, I think, unappreciatively at his presidency as a political failure, but as a policy and as a foreign policy management presidency stands the test of time. And moments like this, where the country says, wait a minute, what actually happened and what it endures. And these moments come out in institutional celebrations like this.
And they come out in the feet of the people who have walked to the edge of the tarmac to simply watch this happen, who feel some connection to the man, to the office, to the country, and there you see them standing, waiting and watching this unfold because of a connection that they have to their country, and just that physically walking, wanting to be there to witness this, really gets at something very fundamental about people in the connection to their
And our colleague Bianna has talked about how Houston loved the Bush family. Before I came to Washington, my last newspaper job was at the Houston Post. I was there for 2 years, and I covered his election night celebration in 1988. It was the first time I'd ever been in the presence of the National Political Press Corps, a press corps I hoped at some point in my career to join. And I remember that night there was something interesting about it, because politics, we all know, can be somewhat hokey and have show demonstrations. And they kept trying to gin up the crowd with call and responses of George Bush, and it never caught on. And one of the reasons it struck me then and strikes me now is because George H.W. Bush had many strengths, but he was not a political showman at any level. He wasn't a rhetorician. He sort of didn't do the whole, it's a presentation part of politics. He did the quieter, harder work of politics, which defined his presidency. But in those moments when either rhetoric or showmanship were called upon, he didn't really have it. But that didn't mean his community didn't love him, didn't mean that there wasn't something deeper about their appreciation of him. He just wasn't really good at the kind of hokier sides of politics.
You know, John Meacham, who is the president's biographer and has really written the definitive work.
Tremendous access to the family and to the H.W. Bush.
He had this anecdote about how Bush, his nickname was called the have-half, because as a kid he would take a candy bar or a cookie and cut it in half and give the half to the other kid. It's almost hard to believe any child doing that, certainly with a candy bar or a cookie. But I think his actions, the president's actions in many years, make that story so believable concerned about the other. And that was forged, in many ways, I think, by his initial military service.
Well, sure. And remember, when you say the greatest generation, part of that greatest generation is not just World War II, it's the Depression before that, and that sense of scarcity. And that sense of, if not privation, we're not certain what the future is going to hold, either economically or geopolitically. The Great Depression and World War II, formative events for everyone from that generation. And that have-half is like, I've got to take care of the person next to me because we're not sure we're going to get through this together.
Major, what we're seeing here is the motorcade is making its way to the ceremony, and so we expect it to begin shortly. The beginning of the slightly more, about 3.5-hour flight back to Washington, D.C., to Joint Base Andrews, where as President Bush would have landed after all of those campaign stops, all of those whirlwind tours across the world, both as president and as vice president.
And as the Bush family arrives and will be greeted there by former President George W. Bush, we should note that when they reach Washington, after a brief ceremony in Washington, the 41st president will lie in state. And so anyone who wants to go can go to the Capitol Rotunda and wait in line, and it'll be open all night, and you can have a look at the president's casket, which I still think is really just one of the most amazing things, you know, to think about. It started with President Lincoln and continues to this day for our presidents and special members of Congress like John McCain, who just lied in state, but really a remarkable thing that you can go do that. And so everyone has the opportunity to say goodbye.
And it's a touchstone moment. I remember when Ronald Reagan passed away. I was obviously a reporter in Washington, but I took my children and we stood in line. I didn't cut the line. It's 3.5 hours. And it's a touchstone moment when you walk in the Rotunda, that most spectacular architectural space in all of Washington, and it's completely silent, and you make one pass around, and then you walk back outside, and you feel, as an American citizen, you've touched something that is unique and enduring and beautiful about our country.
As we see the cars of the motorcade here, this is the way when you're president, the motorcades arrive like this on the tarmac, and the echoes that must be going through for the Bush family as they've been a part of these processions onto that famous plane, as a part of the president's service, as a part of his son's service. And now echoing for the last trip to Washington. Every
detail of this ceremony planned perfectly for the former commander-in-chief. And that's why, of course, the military honor guard there, and we will hear from them shortly, the Army Band, as well as a full departure ceremony as well.
And it's worth noting that this is a political dynasty, but a quiet one. I mean, think about it. Prescott Bush, senator from Connecticut. George Herbert Walker Bush, son a president, another son a governor of an enormously important state. And yet, it's not like Camelot, like this huge radiating family dynasty, and yet it is. It's quiet. It's been a part of American politics for decades. And as you said, Nora, this family links arms, tight, loving, and also very, very careful about all details and the best presentation possible of this moment, this legacy, which is at the top right now of this family's enduring political legacy throughout the country.
You see this motorcade essentially circling the tarmac, and what is Air Force One that Chip just pointed out just came all the way from Argentina and back to Houston to make this journey. That is the hearse carrying the 41st President of the United States. The family will be escorted from the motorcade to a position near the hearse by Major General Howard. He's the general I mentioned earlier who is in charge of this entire state funeral and pacing out everything that we're going to see over the next couple of days with military precision. And just to let everyone know, what we're about to see as well is a full honors will be rendered, including 4 ruffles and flourishes and a hail to the chief with a simultaneous 21-gun salute. And we will stop talking when that happens, yes, because we all want to witness that. We're also learning more about the funeral service that will take place at the National Cathedral in Washington. That happens on Wednesday. We've learned that his oldest son, former President George W. Bush, will speak at that service, and former First Lady Laura Bush and their daughter Jenna will give readings. There will also be remembrances from 3 great friends of the 41st president, former Republican Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming, who we know will be fun to hear from. He's got lots of good stories, always
Absolutely.
does. Mr. Bush's biographer, John Meacham, who is also not only a beautiful writer but speaker, and the former Canadian Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. That will happen at the National Cathedral, where we most recently saw tributes to Senator John McCain. And we see now the hearse pulling up to what is being called Special Air Mission 41. On what looks like a very windy day in Houston. The honors will be rendered shortly for our former Commander-in-Chief, who enlisted when he was just 18 years old, becoming one of the youngest, if not the youngest, Navy pilot to fly during World War II, flying 58 combat missions and almost dying in one where 2 of his crewmates passed away. And he has thought about that his whole life, according to his biographer, the 2 crew members who were lost during World War II.
George, ready, come. All right. Mark. My left. Face.
There you see the Bush family led by former President George W. Bush and First Lady Laura Bush leading the family onto Special Air Mission 41 after his father's casket was placed on the plane. And this really begins what is a several-day tribute to the former Commander-in-Chief and his more than 70 years of service to our country.
And you see there the former president waving from the top of the stairs, just as he would have done so many times getting into that plane as president to board. I mean, think of the resonances of this, to board the plane that his father also, you know, the passenger number one on Air Force One, his casket is on. I mean, the echoes, they just continue throughout this moment.
I mean, this speaks to the dynasty of the Bush family, but also just how unique that moment is. The son walking up the stairs as he did before, literally following in the footsteps of his father, politically and for a time as the commander-in-chief of this country, both aboard Air Force One for this final journey. It is as poignant and, as you mentioned, John, resonant as anything you could see in modern-day American politics.
And testament to the Bush size of the Bush family and the friends in Houston is the long line of those joining onto the plane.
In President George H.W. Bush's final moments, he was able to speak to his family. Some were there in the room. George W. Bush was on the phone, and the last words spoken were, "I love you."
Right. And as anyone who's ever been through this craves, you want a loved one, particularly a parent, to die peacefully, without pain, and surrounded by all whom can be with that loved one. Everyone hopes. It's a constant refrain and yearning in human experience, and for this family, and for that moment, and the country can take some measure of peace in that, precisely as you might want it to have happened.
I asked George W. Bush, what's the most important thing your father taught you? And he said the most important thing he ever said to me was, "I love you," unconditional love. And for those two men who have occupied that Oval Office and know the challenges of occupying that office and leading the country, we are watching the departure ceremony in Houston, Texas, at Ellington Field for the 41st President of the United States. His family there, a military honor guard that sent him off with 4 ruffles and flourishes and a hail to the chief and the simultaneous 21-gun salute.
And the casket will fly from here to Joint Base Andrews, landing around 3:30-ish, and then it will be driven to the Capitol. And when it arrives there at the Capitol, there will be an arrival ceremony and then a service at the Rotunda. And then the casket will lie in state, as Nora mentioned. Anybody can go and pay their respects.
And at the Capitol Rotunda will not only be James Baker, his best friend, who was there with him at the end, holding his hand and rubbing his feet, but also Vice President Dan Quayle will also be there in the Rotunda, as well as former members of President Bush's cabinet to greet him when he arrives at the U.S. Capitol. I was reminded in reading again about his biography that he had run for the Senate twice and lost in Texas and then was elected to Congress. Just one of the many things that former George H.W. Bush did. He lost in politics many times.
Persevered many times. Had many disappointments. Times he thought something was going to be teed up and he got consolation prizes, awkward consolation prizes at times. And that shows you his dimension of perseverance about not only public service, but his own ambition. Things sometimes go together. It's all right to say it out loud. You can be a public servant and be ambitious at the same time, and he was. And he achieved the presidency in part because of that perseverance and that unwillingness to give in or give up after setbacks.
And it was connected, that loss, that ability to come back after setbacks, connected also to his other quality, which is forgiving those who he had competed with, including Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, who beat him in 1980 in the primaries, and then he went on to be his vice president.
Went on to be his vice president, succeeded him at that convention in 1988 in New Orleans, essentially telling Republican delegates, I'll be the third term of the Reagan presidency, when his third term wasn't like the Reagan presidency. It became a disappointment and a political vulnerability for him within the Republican Party.
Chip Reed is there at Ellington Field. Chip?
Nora, we just saw an extraordinary ceremony. You could have heard a pin drop here if it hadn't been for this incredible wind going on. But I've seen that ceremony so many times, or ceremonies similar around the country and at the U.S. Capitol on many occasions. And it always puts a wrenching in your gut to see it. They do it with military precision, as you have mentioned, and that is to honor the people who are involved in this case. Former President George H.W. Bush. You saw quite a few members of the Bush family get on the plane, along with Sully, the president's service dog, who will be given to a military family when he gets back to Washington, D.C. It's about a 3.5-hour flight back to Washington. There will be a ceremony at Joint Base Andrews and then on to the U.S. Capitol, where he will lie in state until Wednesday. Then there will be a memorial service, and then he will come back here to Houston, and he will be taken by train after a funeral service from here to College Station, Texas. It's a special train outfitted just for this occasion. As you mentioned earlier, Nora, they've been planning this for quite some time, and everything is planned up to every meticulous second of this is planned. And there will then be a private burial ceremony on Thursday at the Presidential Library at College Station, Texas. Nora?
Oh, Chip, and beautiful to see that train that is going to take him to his final resting place, and incredible. There you see it. I can imagine
those colors never look bad. They just don't.
They don't.
Air Force One is the most spectacular plane. We've all had a chance to fly it. It is the most beautiful plane to get off, to get on, and to be under the wing of, waiting for the president to come down. And that characteristic wave at the top of the stairs. It's a wave to the country. It's a wave to the world. It's a wave about what America means. And the plane and the train and all those places are symbols of that.
I'm reminded of something from President George H.W. Bush's inauguration speech, where he said, "We are not sums of our possessions. They are not the measure of our lives. In our hearts, we know what matters. We cannot hope only to leave our children a bigger car, a bigger bank account. We must hope to give them a sense of what it means to be a loyal friend, a loving parent, a citizen who leaves his home, his neighborhood, and his town better than he found it."
Not just words.
He was a loving friend and a dear friend to so many, and he did that by his personal phone calls, his notes, his handwritten notes. People would say he wrote handwritten notes for handwritten notes. Thank you.
Well, and the people lined there to see him, as they will be lined up for the next several days, including when that train makes its final trip, are testament to just exactly what you just read, Nora, that his life succeeded in fulfilling what he talked about.
His friendship, I mean, his marriage, 73-year marriage with Barbara Bush. What an incredible partnership. Susan Page has a book coming out that will talk about a biography rather, of the former First Lady. That relationship so incredibly meaningful. His relationship with his children, his 6 children, one who passed away at the age of 3, his grandchildren.
And there you hear the engines of Air Force One getting ready to move.
As many presidents have remarked when they left office, the thing that they will miss most in some ways is this plane. It's
literally unforgettable. There's no ride like it. There just isn't. And anyone privileged enough in any capacity to ride that jet never forgets it.
And this in a somber moment. But the whole family on board. Think about that. Although Marvin Bush, one of his sons, and his wife will greet them when they land in Washington at Andrews Air Force Base. And the team at Andrews Air Force Base that has served many presidents knows the Bush family very well. It is a family.
Sure.
It is a family.
And the stories they no doubt will recount of being in that plane at various stages of their various lives, when George W. Bush was a much younger man visiting with his father, and then George W. Bush's children. That plane has been one in which they have experienced the different stages of their lives that they are in now, and I'm sure they have some tales to tell about their time on it.
And remarking about the Bush family and the Bush marriage, as we all remember, in the '92 campaign, this question of values, family values, what they represented, how resonant they were in late 20th century America. Were they changing? Was that change bad for the country? Did what the Bush family represent fit within those changing times, or was it somehow out of step with these changing times? That's a question that's still not completely answered, but as we look back on this family, that was an enduring part of that greatest generation, that post-World War II approach to not just work life, but family life. It's changed in many dimensions since then, and the passing of George H.W. Bush is a marker in that transition in our country about all sorts of values, how they're articulated, how they're lived through, and how the country comes to appreciate them in their many different dimensions and definitions.
President George H.W. Bush, the last president of the greatest generation, and his friends in Houston there to say a final goodbye. And we honor these presidents and talk about them because the history is extraordinary. And he had 1 term in office as president, but 2 terms as Vice President Reagan. And looking back on him, many will say that he was the most prepared man in history to hold that office. You know, a Navy pilot, an oilman, a congressman, a diplomat, head of the CIA, head of the Republican National Committee
at a very tough time,
a vice president. He had an extraordinary, extraordinary career of service.
And, you know, the ceremony we've seen, and this plane, and the symbols of American government, wrapped into that is this idea of service. And at one point, George Bush was talking about his service, and when he was asked to be CIA director, he talked about the values, and he said one of those values that he had been raised with, quite simply, is that one should serve his country and his president. And so if that is what this president wants me to do, the answer is a firm yes. And that's the automatic yes that you give, and that is really wrapped up in the ceremony that we're watching right now, the automatic yes to your country.
And Special Air Mission 41 is set to depart Houston, Texas, returning to the nation's capital, where the president will lie in state. President George W. Bush said that his father knew that the office is more important than the man, and that one of the jobs of the President of the United States is to strengthen the institution of the presidency and to bring honor to the office. And there's agreement he did bring, I think, honor to the office. Even if you disagreed with his policies, he served honorably.
And the reason to honor the office and be a steward of it is for moments like this, is that because there's a continuity in the system that is built into the office, and you know that you are a temporary steward of it, and that it endures and has endured for a long time.
Well, and also you hold the role as commander-in-chief and protecting the nation. And hold the lives of men and women in your hands and the decisions you make along with your cabinet. And that is one of the most solemn responsibilities of the commander-in-chief.
And the pressures are relentless. The pressures are constant day to day in the presidency. And one of the things that fortified H.W. Bush's approach to the presidency and his sons was history will judge this over time. I will not concern myself as acutely with the judgments of the moment as the judgments of time.
James Baker, his best friend, who served in multiple capacities in the administration, said that the world changed under George H.W. Bush. It did. It saw the end of the Cold War, where America became the lone superpower. Barack Obama told us at CBS News that the president didn't spike the football at that moment, that he dealt with it with humility. That changed the course of history.
Even though some wished he had spiked the ball, there was a sense that we could have this national moment of triumphalism, and he did not indulge either himself, the institution, or the country in that moment of triumphalism for strategic long-term reasons.
And there you see everyone's camera and iPhone up to record at this moment. We all become, I'm reminded by the iPhone, as someone once told me, that we all now are journalists in some ways. We can record history in different ways. And the departure as well of the Military Honor Guard. And now Special Air Mission 41 makes the journey to Washington, D.C., where there will be an elaborate ceremony on Capitol Hill for President George H.W. Bush, where he will lie in state. And there will be more elected officials, names from history, that if you're a history buff, you will recognize many people that served in his cabinet, and Ronald Reagan before that, who will all be there. Vice President Quayle will be there as well on Capitol Hill, all to welcome him to lie in state, and where anyone can go and pay tribute. Because starting tonight through all the way through tomorrow, you can pay a visit if you like to say goodbye.
And take a measure of the moment.
We should note that coverage of President George H.W. Bush will continue throughout the day on your local news on this CBS station and on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN. Also, watch it at cbsnews.com. We're going to have another special report this afternoon from Washington when the former president arrives to lie in state at the U.S. Capitol. And there's going to be a full wrap-up tonight on the CBS Evening News with Jeff Glor. This has been a CBS News special report. Major Garrett, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Norah O'Donnell with John Dickerson, CBS News, Washington.
That new water heater is amazing.
We're really going to stand there for 13 years.
At John Moore, we stand behind our work. Across all our services, nobody beats our warranties.
Go John!